So for everyone who's joined us and is joining us, this is Simple Politics. I'm Professor Kim Wehle, and tonight I'm really thrilled to have on the show my friend and colleague, Gilda Daniels from the University of Baltimore School of Law. She's the author of the fantastic book, Uncounted, The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America. And we might have some time to talk voting, but she's also, more to the point tonight, she's also an expert in what is known as critical race theory. And I say that, what's known as that, as you know, Gilda, it shows up in the Washington Post and blogs on Facebook, on tweets back and forth. People are talking about it in schools, elementary schools, high schools. And I just wanted to get the basics from bottom to top on what this is all about. So thank you again for being with us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kim. It's great to be here tonight. Thank you again for inviting me.
Well, great. So let's start with the basics. Gilda, can you please explain what is critical race theory, or what people call CRT? What is it?
Okay, so starting with the basics, critical race theory is really a movement that's centered around studying certainly the relationship between race, racism, power, and the law. And it certainly is more complex than what we hear about in the media and in the news. Certainly CRT, or critical race theory, has become certainly in common nomenclature, a symbol for other things that it absolutely is not. First thing, I think we need to say that it is not taught in K through 12 grades. Right? Thank
you. Okay, so it's not taught in K through 12. No. So that is a big myth. No one does it, and you're very confident about that. You're a law school professor, also a former DOJ official and multiple presidential administrations. So practicing lawyer, all of those things. You're not an elementary school teacher. No. How are you so confident, Gilda, that CRT, or critical race theory, is not taught in elementary schools, middle schools, and even high schools?
Well, so here's the thing. When you hear people say that they don't want critical race theory taught in public education, particularly in kindergarten through 12th grades, they don't mean critical race theory. And I think it goes back to, I think, when former President Trump said that they would no longer teach or have these anti-bias training in the federal government, and then it moved from anti-bias training being critical race theory, and then critical race theory being taught in K through 12, which none of those things are certainly happening. And certainly the way he categorized anti-bias training as being anti-American is certainly not the case. So I think when people say critical race theory, I think they're using critical race theory as a shortcut for we don't want to teach the historical significance of certainly how race and racism has contributed to American society, right? And so in some instances, when people are saying they don't want critical race theory taught in K through 12, they're essentially saying they don't want to teach an inclusive vision of history. I think there's a recent article, I think in the Washington Post, of a student. I don't know if it's recent or not. Actually, I found it for my class. It was a student who was an AP senior in a high school in Virginia. And she said why, essentially that looking at her AP civics honors book, you could not tell that women made any contribution to American history. And she did a poll and asked her fellow students to name 5 women in American history that had contributed to American history, and they could not, right? And so it's the same with certainly with African Americans, with Asian Americans, with Latinx Americans, right? So having that information included in education, that's what it sounds like they're saying that they don't want in K through 12 classes. Certainly not critical race theory, because critical race theory is essentially, it's for grad schools, certainly for college campuses, as well as law schools in particular, because it is about these relationships between race and racism, power and the law, and certainly talks about how certainly how those things have connected in how we've in how race has been used in regards to creating this, how race is a social construct, and certainly how race and racism has been used to create these dichotomies within our society, where certainly your race, as well as your gender or sexual orientation and other identifying factors, have been used to create this idea of supremacy and inferiority. Right.
So let's unpack. There's a lot to unpack there.
Okay.
So helpful. So I want to talk about what you call what they're mistaking critical race theory for, first of all. So in my mind, Gilda, and you can correct me because you're the expert on this, it's somewhat of a matter of common sense. That is, and you and I both talk about voting. Mm-hmm. The people that could vote when this country was first founded in 1788 were white men with money. That's it. White men with money.
Property.
Property, right? Who had property. So we are a country, and we talk about the framers, the founding fathers. They were white and they were male, right? And that is the primary narrative in history books. And what you're saying is there were other people that contributed to the country that did not make it into the history books, including women, including people of color, and that should be taught maybe more in schools so people understand more than just one slice of our historical narrative. And the absence of that information in K through 12 is consistent with the dominance primarily of white wealthy males in our culture and society for a long time. Would you disagree? Yeah, go ahead.
That is not critical race
theory. Right, now that's my next question. Okay, so that's number one. So it's essentially, okay, we could have a debate. Should we teach about the history of women's rights, the history of, Black Americans, Asian Americans, LGBTQ Americans, all the Latino Americans. Okay,
Indigenous people. Right.
So Indigenous people, exactly. So should we just mix it up more and update and refresh our history for children? That's one debate. Okay, that's one thing. That is somehow morphed into critical race theory is bad. So, and I want to get back to how we got that confusion. Yeah. But okay, what is critical race theory? Now, you teach a class on a bunch of different wonky, fancy, theoretical law professor ivory towers approaches to the law, right? And law professors like to think these things up, including critical race theory. Could you tell us, just list the various kinds of theories that arguably encompass this topic, this kind of concept of theory and the law?
Well, so at the University of Baltimore, as you know, we require students to choose from, I think, 5 courses that are called our law in context courses, and other institutions do a similar thing, but I think we do it very uniquely and certainly very well. And those courses, they can choose from a course from jurisprudence, law and economics, American legal history, comparative history, where we compare compare the American system to other systems, and the course that I teach, which is critical legal theory. I, of course, think that my course is the best. I've told my colleagues that as well.
Yeah, your students love it too. So,
well, critical legal theory, I teach jurisprudence, where we look at judicial approaches. We look at what makes the law, and actually look at judges and how judges make decisions, and look at formalism and legal realism and naturalism and other isms, right, to determine, certainly to look at whether or not you can anticipate how a judge will rule based on certainly their various perspectives, their social upbringings, their education, and other.
They're human, right? They're human. They have experiences. They live in society, and so what these theories do is kind of unpack
Right.
how other areas of expertise impact the law, because it's not just drive 65 miles an hour. It's act reasonably, for example. What is reasonable? It's subjective. It depends on lots of factors. So, okay. So also there's women in the law, or what do we call that?
Theory. So
feminist legal theory.
It's feminist legal theory, and that there are a number of feminist legal theories, but there are also, just as with critical race theory, there are a number of theories, right? And the what folk have to remember is that there are also commonalities. For example, with feminist legal theory, certainly there's the theme is that they want to achieve gender equality, right? And certainly with critical race theory, certainly there are some similarities, such as the belief that race is a social construct, and that racism certainly exists, and it certainly depends on the number of degrees, depending on what scholar you're reading, and that there are ways to address the existence of racism in our society. It certainly varies from scholar to scholar, right? So that's when you say, so when saying that critical race theory is one thing, it's not one thing, or feminist legal theory is one thing, it's a number of different ways in which these scholars believe that we can achieve the goal of equality. So certainly feminist legal theory, critical race theory, looking at judicial approaches, as well as socioeconomic theories as well. And so we look at alternative remedies, such as mediation and restorative justice. And those are all things that we look at in the context of certainly how the role that law plays in particularly with critical race theory. We're analyzing, these are all analytical tools. And that's the other thing to remember, particularly another reason why I'm so confident that it's not taught in K through 12. These are all legal analytical tools, and particularly that analyze law and legal traditions through certainly through history and contemporary experiences, and certainly racial sensibilities of certainly racial minorities, and just as similarly with feminist legal theory, looking at certainly history and contemporary experiences as well. So they're all analytical tools that we use to certainly critique the law through the various lenses, through the lens of race, through the lens of sexual orientation, and through the lens of gender, and so through the lens of socioeconomics. So it's looking at law through those various lenses, and hopefully giving my students a different perspective, and so that they can understand and appreciate those viewpoints.
So one thing is talk about history, what happened in our history, and just be a little more diverse in our history books, K through 12. The other thing is, okay, unpack how that affected this very discrete area of learning, which is law, right? So for all these years, we had enslaved human beings. We had laws developed with slavery. How does that affect our laws today? That the fact that laws developed with humans enslaved will have an impact today, just for example. So Gilda, do you have an idea as to why is it that CRT specifically has now become this rallying cry for people on the right? It's become a political issue. It's become something that that candidates are running for office on. Keep critical racial theory. We're seeing legislation proposed to ban its teaching, when you're telling me it's never even been taught. How did this catch fire? Why is it now, front page news? And when no one really knows, except you and a few other academics in the country, what it really is.
Well, and I think it also became shorthand for something else, right? It became shorthand for, people were saying critical race theory when they really meant Black Lives Matter. People saying critical race theory when they really meant we don't want to teach Black history or Asian American history or indigenous.
So would you say, I mean, I know this is a strong word, but I'm sure there's some that have said this. Would you agree with those that say the banning of critical race theory is itself racist? Is there a difference there?
Well, I think that this idea that you can ban something that doesn't exist, it's certainly in K through 12 is just it's outrageous to me, right? So the fact that we've continued to allow this miseducation, right? That certainly platforms like yours is being used to kind of correct that situation, but certainly not enough. And so, to the extent that I think it's more lazy, right? Because we just, that to understand what critical race theory and for it to be um, for it to be used. I think there certainly are people who may be using it in that way.
That's my question, right? Because politicians are smart. They do polls. And they're not necessarily smart. They're wily, I should say. Some are smart, some are not. But meaning all they want is power. They want to raise money. They want to get reelected. So somewhere along the line, they've decided this is a winning issue for them, right? And the counter argument or the argument against teaching and I love the way you put it, you keep banning something that doesn't exist, right? Let's keep the Martians out of our classroom. Well, that's not something to spend political capital on, right? But they will say critical race theory makes white people feel bad about themselves. It's about shaming people for being white, and they should feel bad, and that's bad for children. Do you have a response to that?
Please repeat that, because I got a notification in the middle of it.
Okay, so I believe politicians have figured that somehow waving the CRT banner is a winning political issue for them, even if they don't understand it. Mm-hmm. And the argument has been critical race theory makes white children feel bad about themselves and feel shame. And I, politician Joe or Jane, am not going to support shaming children. Mm-hmm. So what's your reaction to that as an expert in critical race theory and as someone of color who also knows a lot about voting rights and a lot about, the racial justice issues in America by definition as a legal academic?
Well, again, I think one of the things that we have to do is not adopt their terms, and that's certainly one of the things that critical race theory does say is that we have to control the narrative, right, and control the language. And so I think it is important to no longer call that thing that they're calling critical race theory, because that's not what it is.
What would you call it?
And so this idea that teaching, telling the full story of history and the historical consequences and the contemporaneous consequences makes Johnny feel bad is not a reason not to teach the history of the United States of America, right? The full history of the United States of America. And so I think, in terms of when people or you're saying politicians are smart, or essentially that they are doing this consciously, and that it's not unconscious racism, which is another theory within critical race theory. This is not unconscious racism, but that they're consciously saying these things because they know that it's a winner for them. That makes it no different from I think it was several years ago when they had the welfare queens.
Right. Yeah, which was also code word for something that
right.
associated with low income, primarily women of color, right?
Which makes critical race theory. I mean, essentially, in the way that it's being used is a dog whistle, right? And so I think we have to not use it in that, and not refer to certainly teaching civics, teaching American history, teaching African American history, or Latinx history, or Asian American history in lower education, certainly in K through 12, as CRT, because that is not what it is.
So it's a myth that it's being taught, and we should, on a separate note, teach a fuller picture of American history that includes people that are generally not included in the narrative. I want to ask you something that I've wondered about, and I had a conversation once with a white male, a little older than me, about this question, lives in Massachusetts, Boston, and said that we're not, I don't know anybody who's racist, and really bristled at the word racist. And I just saw in the chat, one of our viewers said, call it a widget. And I said this in the conversation to this guy, I said, call it a widget, call it whatever you want, call it bologna, peanut butter, whatever you want. But it does, that history does inform our culture. We all have it in our experience and in our approach to the world. When I say it, that is a history of marginalization and hierarchies around race, marginalization and hierarchies around gender. And so I ask, Gilda, having I agree with you completely. Words matter. What do you think about just not using that word racism that gets white people so upset? I'm not a racist, but if you say, well, okay, let's talk about how you were raised, what your sensibilities are, what your experiences are, we could call it something else. I'm wondering how you react to that idea, because I don't have an answer myself.
Well, I think it's interesting because we have this I think movement on how to be an anti-racist, and I think that's certainly in the first chapter of Dr. Kendi's book of How to Be an Anti-Racist. He addresses the usage of the term racist, that when people, it's essentially a pejorative term, right? That people are like, well, I'm not a racist, which is and people say, well, I don't, you don't know my heart, or something of that sort. And so what he talks about, so what about, we don't even have to make a determination whether or not you're racist or not, is certainly what Dr. Kendi says. And that we essentially that people are either racist or anti-racist is what he suggests. And that if you're racist, you believe that the people are the problem, right? If you endorse the idea of a racial hierarchy, right, or white supremacy, then he would say, and most people I think would say, oh, I don't believe in white supremacy,
right? 100%.
And he said, so you will be an anti-racist if you certainly work towards racial equality, right? And that racists believe that the people are the problem, that the folk who are poor or the folk who are in prison, that they are there because they are the problem. It's certainly what a racist mentality, but an anti-racist mentality would say, let's look at the power, locate the roots of the problems in power and policies.
I just wonder, somebody also in the chat mentioned sort of reverse psychology, and I wonder if there are just thoughts put in this, because I just think, obviously I'm white, and have a lot of, friends, family, whatever, white. Mm-hmm. And it's just, when people think racist, they think Ku Klux Klan and hoods hanging people from trees. And the answer is, oh, that's in the past. Gosh, that's horrible. I would never endorse that. Racism, slavery was bad, but we're through that. And then when that word racism, I think that's associated with those really egregious horrors, gets transferred to 2022, people really bristle. And I'm just wondering where, maybe that's the dog whistle of CRT, right? Don't call me that. Don't call me racist. But it still is part of who we are. We all are in a way racist, right? Yeah. Because we grew up in a racist environment.
Right. And I think we also I think we have grown up to believe that it's not racism unless you see the hoods, or you see the dogs, or you see the fire hoses. Mm-hmm. And so certainly critical race theory says that there are subtler forms of racism, right? And that are systematic, right? That we need to unpack, right? That we need to analyze, that we need to certainly apply various theories to in doing so. So and it's interesting because you see that in law, you see that in Supreme Court opinions and other opinions, when they say, yes, racism still exists or discrimination still exists, but not enough. Right, not enough to say that it's discriminatory, right, or that it's unconstitutional, and I think that's the assessment, because it's not enough, because they're comparing it to dogs and water hoses and bull connor and other things, right? So when you don't see those things, but you see disparities in the number of drop boxes or how many polling places have been closed, then they're saying, well, that's not enough, right? There's not. They don't think there's not someone standing in a hood saying you can't come in to vote, but then there are all these other impediments that stand in the way. So so make you call it something else.
I love that, and I'm assuming you're referring to the Brnovich case in part that came out of the United States Supreme Court last year, just for our viewers. So in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act that basically forced states to comply with the 14th Amendment and the post-Civil War amendments, 15th Amendment, that made it easier or made it constitutionally protected for people of color and later for women to vote, but primarily people of color. So Voting Rights Act, the Congress comes in and says, Justice Department, you're going to make sure that they're not coming up with excuses to keep people of color from the ballot, recite the Declaration of Independence, count how many bubbles in a bar of soap, etc. Fast forward to this year with this Supreme Court. I don't think Coney Barrett was on it, but right before her. And the Supreme Court in 2013 struck down a big piece of it. A case went out of Arizona to the court, just like you're describing, saying, listen, these rules make it really hard for low-income people and indigenous people and people of color to vote. They don't have cars in the same numbers. They don't live next to post offices. They're not. They don't have the same kind of infrastructure that when you have one drop box for miles and miles, it means people can't vote. And I'm paraphrasing, but Justice Alito wrote an opinion on behalf of the court that basically said what you're saying. Listen, it's not really racism. It's not big enough. And that was quite troubling to me. I want to ask if you listen to Biden's speech, and he talked about race. You're either with us or against us yesterday. I wonder what you feel about, and of course, President Obama got a lot of heat for how he handled race, right? Didn't handle it well enough from people, maybe someone within the African American community, maybe did too much. What do you think of Biden's speech and how Biden is framing voting, and in particular voting in race? Because as you also probably know, Mitch McConnell, and just slammed him today, which in my mind means he smells blood in the water. He thinks it was a bad maneuver. Do you have a view on that, Gilda?
I did not listen to the entire speech. I didn't, and nor McConnell's rebuttal. Giving the speech in Atlanta to talk about voting rights, certainly where John Lewis was a congressperson and certainly leader of SNCC and other organizations. I thought it certainly was historically relevant for him to give the speech there. But I think certainly one of the responses certainly has been that we've had enough speeches. That certainly there's a need for more for legislation, and the interesting thing is that certainly the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is something that he mentioned in his speech, is a response to another Supreme Court case. It is Congress's response to the Shelby County case from 2013. So when McConnell's saying this is political, this is like the Congress is trying to do what the court told him to do 8 years ago in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and with the Freedom to Vote Act, which is the more omnibus case that would provide things like same-day voter registration and a standard period for early voting, then Congress is trying to do what America said they wanted: more uniformity after the 2020 election, saying, why is it that Pennsylvania can have early voting or same-day voter registration or some other mechanisms, and they don't have that in Texas, right? So why not have some uniform measures? And Congress has done it before with the National Voter Registration Act, which is the motor voter law, which allows people to register, among other things, allows people to register in the DMV or their motor vehicle association. And so with McConnell saying that this is outrageous, like, no, Congress is doing what the American people said they wanted. They wanted more uniformity. They didn't want this kind of crazy quota of laws, and they're doing what the Supreme Court said what the Supreme Court told them to do in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So that's all political, and so hopefully we'll see some movement, because there's definitely a need for some more tools because they have been in many ways dismantled.
Right. I mean, and when the Supreme Court dismantled Section 5 back in 2013, that was super majorities in both houses of Congress, right? That supported that. And the Supreme Court steps in and kills it, which I thought was, really overstepping its boundaries in terms of the separation of powers. So Gilda, I know that you're not in Congress right now, et cetera, but do you have any sense of whether it's possible to get Manchin and Sinema to make changes to the filibuster so that some of these bills can go forward? Because we only have really between now and November. What's your sense? I hope it's positive, because everything I hear is really negative.
Well,
that essentially Democrats can't do anything. Poor Democrats. I was actually on a panel with Harvard law professor Larry Tribe on this. And, he said, well, the Democrats' hands are tied. They can't do anything.
I certainly hope that's not the case. And I think we also, while we continue to look at these two individuals, we can also look at the other 50 on the other side and say there aren't two people, there aren't two Republicans who believe that we need this kind of legislation, or, so I think we're again focusing on the wrong thing. And I think we need to focus on broader issues. And I like Senator Raphael Warnock from Georgia, that someone asked him, should they get rid of the filibuster? And he essentially said, I don't care what they do. I don't care how they do it. I don't care how they do it. I don't care who votes, which 51 people or 50 persons vote for it. This just needs to be voted on. It needs to be passed, and we need to move on. And it just demonstrates how we have to center our democracy on the right to vote. I mean, democracy is centered on the right to vote.
Well, yeah, and that's where the battleground is, because as you say, Republicans, they claim there's voter fraud, but they're not willing to even even vote on the Freedom to Vote Act, which would fix a lot of those holes, right? It would require paper ballots. It would require audits. It would do all these things to fix a fake voter fraud, and they're not willing to do any of it, which means they're cynically liking the fact that Americans can't vote and pick their leaders anymore. That entrenches the minority party, in my view. But I want to go back to race for a second. What did you think, just as an aside, at Stacey Abrams' decision not to join the president in Georgia for his big speech?
There were others as well.
But she's a biggie, right? She's a biggie in voting. And of course, she's a woman of color. There's it was taken by the media as a snub, and she must have thought that through. Maybe you don't have any views on that, but I'm just curious, given that we're talking about the intersection between voting and race.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know that she didn't attend. I didn't know that she'd been invited, and I'm sure she has her own reasons for not attending, and certainly we can, interpret it a number of ways. But I trust her. I trust her judgment. I think she has certainly been focused on empowering the people of Georgia, and I think she'll continue to do that. But I thought it was very interesting. I didn't know that was scheduled. Again, I was not focused on.
We started teaching this week.
Yes,
Baltimore started teaching this week, so it's a tough one, and so
Absolutely.
It's particularly special. Well, before we wrap up, I want to ask you, back to critical race theory, and we have some to-dos on the table. One, you said, listen, we got to change the narrative and talk about it like there is no critical race theory in schools. That's a myth. That's fake. Call it history. We just need a broader aspect of history. What else can people do you think?
I'm sorry.
And I mean, what else people watching? What can they do about this, not just critical race theory in that discussion, but what we just talked about, this major disconnect between, okay, there's not the dogs and the fire hoses and the lynchings, but it's still real. And people, anti-racist people of color are saying, listen, it's real. Don't deny our experience. And then we're seeing white people say, stop calling me a racist. What is the takeaway, particularly for people who have different experiences than people of color in America? What's the takeaway to have a more thoughtful, productive approach to this, do you think?
Well, I think it's also, I think we have to stop looking for extremes. Because I think it's, as we were saying, we're looking for, hoods and dogs and fire hoses. Folks are like, oh, if we don't see that, then we don't have to address how race is used or how racism is used in our use in our country. I mean, certainly when we in the 2 summers ago with the killing of George Floyd, that was a moment where people were like, this cannot happen in our country. Right. And to see, and I think some people would consider that extreme, where certainly people of color were saying these kinds of events happen quite often in our country, and we need to recognize that and address it. And so there's also been legislation on that as well in regards to criminal justice reform. So I think what people can do is educate themselves. There's a lot of literature out there. We can provide some reading resources to go along with this chat as well. But certainly educate yourselves, and it is American history, right? So when we're talking about, it is American history, and it in the history of America is deep and wonderful and complex.
And a lot of it's untold, and a lot of it wasn't even written down. And
right.
Well, one of the pieces I should add, as far as educating yourselves, is your fantastic book, Uncounted, on voting rights. And I know you're continuing to do tremendous, important scholarly work and teaching in that. So Gilda Daniels, thank you again, my friend and colleague, for joining Simple Politics tonight. And thanks for all our viewers, particularly the students out there. I've seen some of the names in there, for joining in for this really, I think, fascinating conversation. Thanks, Gilda.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night.